Well, hello there. So you want to learn how to invest your money, but you don't know what to look for in a company. Well, through my presentation I'm going to show you what you can look for in a company if you want to make a short-term loan, if you want to make a long-term loan, and if you want to buy equity or stock in a company. Now the four companies we're going to look at are two retail drugstore companies, Walgreens and CVS. We're also going to look at Lamar Advertising as well as Amedisys, which is a company that they own different home health services as well as different ambulatory care services. So the first thing we're going to look at is how to make a short-term loan, a 6-month loan to be specific. Now the first thing to look at is a company's current ratio, and what that tells us is the ratio of current assets to current liabilities. So current assets would be things like cash, receivables, prepaid expenses, as well as any inventory and supplies, and current liabilities are anything that a company owes on that has to be paid within the operating cycle. Usually that's about a year. So if we look at the current ratio for these four different companies, we see that Walgreens has consistently had a better current ratio, or well, there's a big spike here about 7 quarters ago, and at the moment, as of the last quarter, they're doing a little bit better than these other companies. They're about at a 1.5 point current ratio. But there's a couple of other different liquidity ratios we want to look at. One of them is the quick ratio, and what this tells us, it's all the information of the current ratio, but what it takes out the inventory, and so that gives us a better idea. Because if a company has to sell their assets to pay off a debt, it's a little bit harder to pay off their inventory, to sell their inventory rather, and they might have to sell it for a lower amount than what they would expect. So the quick, and also this does include receivables. So the quick ratio for Walgreens as well as Lamar and Amedisys is at about the same level, and CVS is well below the other three. So what that tells us about CVS is that they have a lot of inventory that is sitting around, hasn't been sold yet, as opposed to the other ones. That inventory is making up a big part of their current ratio. Let's also look at the cash ratio. What the cash ratio tells us is the ratio of just their cash to their current liabilities that have to be paid off. So this is the best indicator of whether if a company is going to be able to pay off their liabilities, because everybody takes cash. So cash ratio, Walgreens is by far better than the other three companies. They've been consistently better almost the whole way through. For a little while, Amedisys passed them up. That was about 4 quarters ago. But Walgreens has had consistently more cash than the other three companies. So by looking at these three ratios, it looks like if you're going to make a short-term loan, your best bet is to go with Walgreens. If you wanted to pick a second company, I personally wouldn't pick a second company just because Walgreens stands out a lot better than these other companies as far as making a short-term loan. Now, if you wanted to make a long-term loan, there's a few different long-term solvency ratios that you want to look at. One of those is times interest earned, and what this tells us is how much a company is earning in order to pay off their interest. For all the interest that they have to pay to borrow money, how much money are they earning from it? So if we look at this, CVS and Walgreens at about the same level. CVS is a little bit better than 10, they did about 11. Walgreens is at about 9 times interest earned. Lamar is at about 4, and Amedisys is actually in the negative, but they have gotten better over these last 5 years. We're looking at a 5-year term right now as opposed to a 10-quarter term like we were looking at for the current ratio. So times interest earned, CVS and Walgreens are well above the other two companies. We also want to look at debt to equity, and what this is going to tell us is how much debt that how much of a company's assets are tied up in debt as opposed to being tied up in in stockholders' equity. And that's important because a company has to pay off its debts at a certain time. Stockholders' equity, that's something that can be pushed off into the future, but liability is something that has to be paid off at a certain time. And if we're talking about giving a company money as debt, it means that they have to pay off all their other liabilities and debts before they pay us. So if we look at the debt to equity ratio, Lamar is far and away has a lot more debt to equity than these other three companies. Walgreens, CVS is a little bit better than Walgreens, and then Amedisys is at the bottom, which is a good thing. You want to have a lower debt to equity ratio. So looking at these two ratios, debt to equity and times interest earned, I would probably go ahead and go with Walgreens again because their times interest earned is close enough to CVS, and they're doing better in terms of the debt to equity ratio. But they're really both really close, so I could maybe go ahead and say that I'd give it to both of them as far as a long-term 5-year loan. Now the last thing we're going to look at is which company would you buy equity in, like for instance a 50% equity, 50% stake in. So most important thing to look at is return on equity. How much money are stockholders making for the equity that they put into a company? So Lamar, over the past 5 years, really over the past year and a half, they've had a better return on equity than these other companies. They're really kind of a growing company. So they're doing really well on return on equity. We also want to look at their equity multiplier, and with this factors in to determining return on equity, because if a company has a lot of leverage against its assets, what equity multiplier tells us is how many more assets a company has than equity. Because if you have a high equity multiplier, that means you have a lot of assets that are being financed through liabilities as opposed to stockholders giving you money as part of ownership in the company. And so we see that Lamar has a much higher equity multiplier than the rest of these. It's gone between 4 and 4.5. It has gone down. It's improved by almost a point, but it's still a lot higher than the rest of these. So, but they do have a much higher return on equity. So it's really hard to look at. Let's look at their return on assets, just to give us an idea of how efficiently these companies are using their assets. And we see that Lamar, even though they do have a really high equity multiplier, they're still doing better with the assets that they have. They're making more money on their assets. They're at about between 7 and 8. They're doing better than all these companies. So, the equity multiplier, it is kind of a deterrent, but I would say probably take the risk. They're obviously a growing company. They have much higher return on equity, and they have a lot better asset efficiency. So I would say go ahead and buy the equity in Lamar, because I think it's a worthy risk. So thanks a lot for watching, and I hope you pick the right company to invest in.